Monsieur, here we go. Bienvenido a este café a nuestra show.
Hello and welcome to the GV4e2 Week 6 lecture, which is on electoral systems and redistribution. I will remind you of the structure of this course. Early on, we discerned two aspects of democracy. First, that democracy involves some form of voting, and second, that this voting takes place in some sort of institutional framework which must, at least to some extent, be constitutional. So not everything is decided by voting, or at least a simple majority vote. The course has been organized around examining first constitutions and the intersection between capitalism and democracy, and now we're moving into the issue of voting or elections and the relationship between capitalism and democracy. And as you will recall from our discussion in week 3, it has often been the case that defenders of capitalism or advocates of capitalism have been pessimistic about the capacity of democracy to preserve it because they fear that poorer voters will vote in ways that fundamentally undermine how capitalism works. For instance, classical liberals argued that poor people would vote themselves benefits. Meltzer and Richard gave a more sophisticated version of that same argument. Their version of the argument comes up a lot in the readings for this week, so it's worth reviewing quickly. Meltzer and Richard argued that democracy creates a political bias for redistribution. This is because the median voter, the voter whose vote one needs to get to build a coalition that can win a majority anyway election, will always have, or absent a very bizarre distribution of income, will always have an income less than that of the average voter. And this means that it's always possible to put together a coalition of people that would benefit from redistributing from the upper half of the wealth or income distribution to the lower half of the wealth or income distribution. Here's an example of what real-world income distribution looks like. This happens to be the income distribution in the UK in the middle of the last decade. You'll see that the median is indeed less than the mean. This is per week, and you'll note the big spike on the far right. That is because the scale doesn't go up any further, so that if you kept the scale the same as the rest, the slope would keep going down and down and down. It's not the case that there's an overwhelming number of rich voters out there that could swamp the rest of them. And then the last variety of argument that we saw earlier about why poor voters ought to be a threat to capitalism came from the Marxists. The Marxists believed that there is a zero-sum distributional conflict between capitalists and workers, and that were the workers, who are more numerous, allowed to vote, they would recognize the nature of this conflict and overcome it by eliminating capitalists and capitalism. So as we know, this hasn't happened. The fears of or hopes of all of these groups seem to have been quite dramatically overstated. So we want to ask, and this is the big question of this week, why were they wrong? Why is it the case that the predominance, the numerical predominance of relatively poorer voters doesn't mean that democracy cannot coexist with capitalism? The first reason is something known as multidimensionality, which just means in this context that politics plays out in multiple dimensions. People care about things other than redistribution. The median voter theorem only works when there's one dimension of politics. As soon as there's multiple dimensions, the process of getting a majority together becomes much more complicated. The reason that you can say, oh, well, the median voter is the one that you need for a majority is because you're assuming that voters care only about that one dimension. Once there are multiple dimensions, there could be multiple median voters on each dimension. Getting the median voter on any particular one doesn't necessarily mean that you get the median voters on all of them, so it becomes much more complicated. Furthermore, even redistribution features multiple dimensions. You can think of dividing society into groups, different bits of which get different handouts. There's even if you agree that the lower half ought to redistribute from the upper half, how do you distribute within the lower half, and so on and so forth. So that turns out not to be the assumption of a single-dimensional politics that's necessary for the median voter theorem to work doesn't even turn out to work that well for distributional politics. And furthermore, of course, there's lots of issues on the political table, on any political table, besides redistribution. One of them that has gotten a lot of attention in the literature on redistributive politics that focuses on cross-national comparisons is the issue of ethnicity or race. So the authors, the economists Alesina and Glaser, I suppose Alesina is both a political scientist and an economist, wrote a book about the distinctions, which are very marked, between social policy in the United States and in Europe. And one of the things they argued in that book was that racial division reduces support for social spending to the extent that racial divisions or ethnic divisions overlap with income distribution. Voters in the middle of the income distribution may feel that voters poorer in the income distribution are not the same. They may have some form of racial or ethnic bias or resentment against those poorer voters, and so they won't vote to fund redistributive efforts towards them. That's the way the argument goes. So there's a multidimensionality then to the politics. It's not just about redistribution, but also about to whom does redistribution go, and what race or ethnicity is benefited or harmed by this. To back up this theory, they show that it appears that racial homogeneity leads to more generous social welfare spending. That's the percent of social welfare spending as a share of GDP on the left-hand side against an index of racial fractionalization. You can see here's the U.S., which has much more racial fractionalization than, say, the famous Scandinavian welfare states, and they have less. In the U.S., they have less social spending. So this implies that one needs to change the question. The question of the older literature was, how is the reconciliation between capitalism and the predominance of relatively poor voters possible at all? The question of the new literature is, how does this reconciliation take place? How does it vary? And why? So let's start by describing the contrast in social spending, and I'll draw your attention to this column here. If you compare the share of government expenditure in different countries, you will see very marked differences. In particular, the U.S. stands out a great deal from both continental Europe and even the United Kingdom. And a lot of this difference is driven by differences in social benefits and other redistributive transfers. So you can see that there are indeed very marked contrasts between the United States and Europe, thus the subtitle of their book, A World of Difference. Now you might want to ask, how are such dramatic differences possible at all? There were countries redistributing over 50% of GDP on that previous slide, how was it that that was even possible? Well, Lindert, in a piece that you'll be reading for next week, argues that the funding of redistribution matters a great deal. We had from Kaletsky, and also discussed in lecture from week 3, we talked about the issue of a possible capital strike, the issue of investors refusing to invest when they didn't like the policies of a government. What Lindert argues is the reason that high levels of redistribution don't cause a capital strike. This isn't quite the way he phrases it, but this is the import of his argument. The reason that these high levels of redistribution don't cause a capital strike is because they are funded by taxes not on the wealthiest and not so much on corporations, but rather funded by taxes on the middle class. And the middle class has fewer options for evading taxation, and as a result, they're a good tax target. So if you're wondering how such wide variations in social spending are possible in a world where investors might be tempted to disinvest if they were heavily taxed, one part of the story, if you believe Lindert anyway, and I think he's got a pretty convincing case, is that the funding of redistribution matters. Okay, now still in the framework of the new question, which is how does the reconciliation between poor voters and democracy and capitalism vary in different circumstances, it's helpful to talk about the concrete organization of social welfare systems, of redistributive systems in different countries. And when people in comparative politics and comparative public policy do this, they very often refer to something known as the three worlds of welfare capitalism, which was the title of a book by Esping Andersen. And in this book, Esping Andersen, as you might imagine, argues that there are three models of welfare capitalism, the first of which is liberal. The second, in the liberal model, the state is relatively weak, by which he means just that it redistributes relatively little. It doesn't necessarily mean that the state is weak. Under no sensible definition of state weakness would you conceive of the United States as having a weak state. And labor is also relatively weak. Labor doesn't have a systematic political influence. In the Christian democratic model of welfare capitalism, which is also sometimes known as the corporatist model, welfare capitalism is ordinarily introduced from above, the archetypical example being 19th century German Chancellor Bismarck's introduction of welfare provisions. And let me add that on Christian democratic welfare capitalism, it's ordinarily, when introduced from above, it's introduced from above on a motivation of diffusing social conflict, of trying to find a way to placate, if you will, the working class. That's why it's called corporatist, because it involves a vision of society in which society is organized into corporations, not corporations in the sense of businesses, but corporations in the sense of parts of the social organism as a whole, a way of thinking about classes not as combatants in some struggle over, in a zero-sum struggle over the division of value added, but rather thinking about classes as parts of the social whole, as corporations within the social whole, so a specific sense of corporation. And Christian democratic welfare states are often known as corporatist states for that reason. And the final model of welfare capitalism is social democratic welfare capitalism. And the distinguishing feature of this, per Esping Andersen, is that it rests on labor power, that it involves a significant institutionalized role for labor-backed parties that see their mission as defending the interests of the working class. I'll go through each of these three models in a little bit more detail. I'll try to make this brisk. This is just background. In the liberal welfare state, and the archetypical example here is the US, the UK broadly similar, protection from poverty is residual, which is to say it's designed only to help people with the worst and most immediately threatening aspects of poverty, such as hunger. The safety net is only for the neediest. People who are having trouble in the market can get help only if they're the neediest. Benefits are means tested. In other words, if you have an income, you have a hard time getting social welfare benefits. And social services are very limited. Finally, replacement rates are low. This means that replacement rates are defined as the share of your salary that you get in unemployment benefits when you're unemployed. Liberal welfare states have low replacement rates, which means it's much preferable to be employed than to live on unemployment benefits. In these circumstances, the middle classes opt for, or are prompted into opting for, shall we say, market solutions, which means they tend to try to insure themselves by, for instance, accumulating their own savings for retirement, accumulating savings in the case of unemployment, or more regularly in recent years, making sure that they have access to credit. Now let's turn to a Christian democratic welfare state, the stereotypical example being Germany. Welfare benefits are quite extensive, but they are distributed selectively. They're not necessarily distributed to everyone. They're distributed in line with a corporatist vision. So, for instance, in ways that might preference some kinds of workers over others, that are, when these different types of workers are conceived as forming different parts of society. Social insurance exists, so there's certainly compared to liberal welfare states, relatively broad welfare provision, but it is especially related to industry. It's especially organized around the needs of industrial workers, and it provides particular benefits for them. Replacement rates are high, entitlements are also high. And the Christian democratic welfare state tends to exclude some groups, especially women and the young, who have not acquired necessarily well-paid jobs in industry. If you have a well-paid job in industry, and you lose that job, you get high replacement rates, good benefits while you're looking for a new job. But if you're not in that group, you have a much more difficult time. And as might be implicit in the foregoing, it tends to be family-oriented. The whole system tends to be set up around the idea that there is a male breadwinner or a single breadwinner in a family who's responsible for earning money, and somebody else at home, usually a woman, taking care of the family. The welfare state is set up to benefit that conception of a family. This is a model of welfare state that integrates the middle classes. People who have middle class jobs also get good benefits from the welfare system, unlike in a liberal welfare system where people in the middle class generally don't benefit very much from the welfare system. The final model of welfare state that Esping-Andersen specifies is the social democratic one. Here the archetypical example is Sweden. This sort of welfare state is characterized by extensive benefits, and these benefits are open to everyone. They're entitlements on the basis of citizenship, so not, for instance, linked to employment in particular kinds of work. Replacement rates are very high. The state provides a lot of services at high quality and high cost. And again, the middle classes are integrated, but on an even broader basis than in the Christian democratic welfare state, because the entitlements are on the basis of citizenship, they're universal, and therefore they're not means tested, by the way. Okay, so we've dealt with the three models of welfare capitalism, three different ways in which redistribution is organized in capitalist societies. Now let's talk about the contemporary debate on redistribution and distribution. And much of this debate tries to explain what's known as the Robin Hood paradox. Now, I hope that most of you are familiar with the figure of Robin Hood, who has been, of course, very heavily storied, and many movies and so on have been made about him. The basic idea with Robin Hood is that he steals from the rich and gives to the poor, right? So Robin Hood ought to show up in places where there are not so many rich and lots of poor, in other words, when he's needed for redistributive purposes. But the Robin Hood paradox is that is not where Robin Hood seems to show up. In fact, distributive equality and redistributive equalization go together. What that means is that earnings before taxation and redistribution, when those are quite equal, redistributive policies are also generous. So it is the more equal societies that also have more generous redistribution. You can see this on the graph here that is from the piece by Kenworthy and Pontusson that you'll be reading. They measure along the x-axis here earnings inequality, so the ratio of the top 10% to the bottom 10% and how much they earn. You'll see that the U.S. here has the highest level of earnings inequality, and it also has the smallest level of total public expenditure as a share of GDP. But, for instance, very equal Scandinavian countries like Denmark and Sweden, where the earnings inequality is not nearly so marked, have a very high share of public spending. So Robin Hood is not showing up where there would seem to be great demand for his services. He's showing up where there would seem to be less demand for his services. The other thing that the contemporary debate tries to explain, so one thing is this Robin Hood paradox, the other is why the Robin Hood paradox seems to basically persist over time. The cross-national patterns seem to be quite enduring. And we'll be looking at several ways, but two key ways to resolve the Robin Hood paradox. One of these is known as power resources theory, and it will be represented in the reading from Corpy that you'll be doing. Corpy takes the position that capitalists and workers are in a distributional conflict, even if they're dividing the fruits of a positive-sum game, so he's not like a classical Marxist that thinks they're in a zero-sum game. Nevertheless, there is a distributional conflict between capitalists and workers. The equality of market distribution is determined by the bargaining power of labor, especially unionization. In other words, if labor is in a good bargaining situation, it will be able to demand higher wages. If labor is able to demand higher wages, this will give you a more equal income distribution. So, in examining the Robin Hood paradox, we need to look at two things, the income distribution and then the amount of redistribution, and try to figure out what explains each of them. Corpy says that the income distribution is explained by the bargaining power of labor. Then the second thing one needs to explain is redistribution, and Corpy argues that this is determined by the political power of labor or left-wing parties. So when labor or left-wing parties are strong, they also lead to high levels of redistribution. He uses a term here, decommodification, which traces back to Polanyi, but popularized by the aforementioned Esping Anderson. This just means that workers or wages don't entirely respond to supply and demand. They don't behave entirely like a commodity because, for instance, people can draw unemployment benefits when they don't have a job. So they're not treated entirely, their income does not entirely depend on what they fetch in the market. So Corpy looks at this two things and says, well, you get a highly equal income distribution and high levels of redistribution together in those countries where labor is strongly unionized and also has strong political representation. A second way of resolving the Robin Hood paradox, that it's a competitor with power resources theory, says that it doesn't depend. The reason the Robin Hood paradox exists doesn't reflect the way that power resources, labor's power resources in particular, operate, but rather reflects something known as a variety of capitalism. And this argument has been put forward by Iverson and Soskis, whom you'll also be reading for the coming week. And they argue that both market distribution and state redistribution are functionally linked to a variety of capitalism. Well, we need then to understand what is a variety of capitalism. Some of you will have encountered this material before in GV4e2. There is a summary in the Iverson and Soskis piece, and Corpy also talks about it a bit in his piece. The basic idea of varieties of capitalism theory is that rich country capitalisms can be divided into two broad categories. In liberal market economies, firms, workers, states, and markets coordinate based on arm's length or market mechanisms. So, for instance, wage determination in a liberal market economy tends to more be through individualized labor market solutions. So what can each individual worker get on the market as opposed to a union bargained or coordinated bargaining across the economy solution. Such solutions are more characteristic of coordinated market economies in which coordination problems like how do wages get set are solved by long-term institutionalized interactions among market players. So that's the big picture with varieties of capitalism. It's about the extent to which the different key actors in capitalism, especially workers and employers, are organized into groups that can coordinate matters among themselves and with each other, or whether the coordination is handled simply through market mechanisms. If I don't want to deal with you, I deal with someone else, as opposed to the whole group of people that I might be dealing with gets organized. Excuse me. The whole group of people I might be dealing with gets organized, and I get organized with everybody I might need to deal with, and we all bargain. That's more a coordinated market economy. Now, for present purposes, the key thing about varieties of capitalism is that they enable and rest on distinct patterns of skill formation, the way that especially workers acquire skills. And Hall and Soskis, who introduced this variety of theorizing, and Soskis and Iverson, that in the piece you'll be reading for this week, argue that there are restrictive conditions needed for a worker to make a confident investment in acquiring specific skills. So for instance, suppose I learn not how to operate computers in general, but I might learn how to operate a particular kind of computerized machine tool that's important in the automobile industry. So suppose I'm going to make that kind of investment in a very specific skill that I won't be able to use elsewhere. What do I need to be sure of before I start making that sort of investment? Well, I'll need relatively secure employment. If I'm going to invest in acquiring this skill, I want to make sure I can use it. I'll also need relatively generous unemployment insurance, because without that, if I lose my job and the only thing I know how to do is to operate this highly specialized machine tool, until I may need to look for a while until I can find another job, and I need generous unemployment insurance during that period. If on this argument I don't get those two things, then I won't want to invest in the acquisition of the highly specific skill in the first place. So that's what labor needs in order to acquire specific skills. Capital needs, what does capital need if it's going to try to work with workers that have these highly specific and expensive skills? Well, it needs cooperative labor, first of all, because once somebody has a very specific skill, their threat to withhold their labor in circumstances where it might be hard to find somebody to replace them could lead to the payment of very high wages. So if capital is going to rely on highly skilled labor, it also needs ways of ensuring that that labor is relatively cooperative, in addition to the extent that the funding for acquiring or teaching of specific skills comes from industry. It's necessary that industry coordinate in some way around the provision of such training, because suppose one company trains a worker to operate the specialized machine tool, and then that worker goes off to work for another firm that didn't pay for the training. That would make it hard to coordinate, to provide the training in the first place. So in order to make a confident investment in specific skills, one needs then these relatively secure, this whole set of institutions: relatively secure employment, generous unemployment insurance, cooperative labor, and coordination in training and wage setting. In a liberal market economy, you don't get as many specific skills because these things are missing. In a coordinated market economy, you get many more specific skills because these institutions are in place. One implication of all of this is that a variety of capitalism, not what I wanted to do, there we go. A variety of capitalism is associated with a variety of welfare state. In those countries in which the variety of capitalism is a coordinated variety, because relatively secure employment and unemployment insurance is necessary, you get a generous welfare state. In a liberal market economy, those things are not as demanded because skills are more specific, and so on this argument you get a less generous welfare state. All of this implies then that labor-capital conflict is not inevitable. In particular, both capital and labor might be interested in a set of institutions that enables investment in highly skilled labor, or alternatively, in circumstances of a liberal market economy, laborers acquire general skills as a substitute for having state insurance, and so, at least as this argument goes, they don't need as much state insurance, and capital is happy with that as well. So how does all of this add up to a resolution of the Robin Hood paradox? Well, there are two parts of it. One part is the variety of capitalism argument that we just went through. Market distribution and state redistribution reflect the variety of capitalism. In a coordinated market economy, the wage scale is more compressed because there are more explicit bargaining institutions for the reasons I discussed while showing you the previous slide, and there is more state redistribution than in a liberal market economy. So you get more unequal distribution and less redistribution in a liberal market economy, and vice versa in a coordinated market economy, so that goes together with the Robin Hood paradox. However, Iverson and Soskis extend this by saying that state redistribution also reflects the electoral system. And they compare two kinds of electoral systems, which we talked about a little bit earlier in the course. A proportional representation system, and in a proportional representation system, the representation of parties in parliament and in government is relatively proportional to the share of votes they get. And they compare this to a first-past-the-post or majoritarian system in which the representation of parties in Parliament may not be very close to their share of votes. For instance, suppose Parliament is elected from geographically specified districts, and there are two parties, and one party wins 51% in every district. They get 100% of the seats because they won a majority in every district, but they only had 51% of the votes. In a proportional representation system, where you might have party lists organized on a nationwide basis. If a party got 51% of the vote, it would get roughly 51% of the seats, and if you got 49% of the vote, you get roughly 49% of the seats. So that's the difference between proportional representation and first past the post, and what Iverson and Soskis are arguing is that proportional representation systems give you more redistribution, and first past the post ones give you less redistribution. So why is that? Well, they give you a model, which they discuss in the paper you'll be reading. They say that let's think of the electorate as composed of three social classes, and this should say of, shouldn't be or, of equal size for modeling purposes, a low income, middle income, and high income group. And they say, and they're modeling things such that any combination of two groups forms a majority. So in order to win the election, you've got to get 2 out of 3 of L, M, and H, the low, middle, and high income groups. However, L and H is a pretty unlikely coalition, and a coalition of the rich and poor against the middle class is a pretty odd thing to imagine. The interests are too diverse, so this gives you two plausible options for a coalition that can win an election. A lower income plus middle income one, what they call a center-left one that is pro-redistribution, and a middle income plus a higher income coalition that is anti-redistribution. Now, which one of these do you get? Well, they argue that that depends on the kind of electoral system you have. The middle group, the middle income group, is decisive, but what its decision is depends on the character of the electoral system. And Iverson and Soskis argue that what the middle income voters will decide to do depends on what they think will happen after the election. If M forms an alliance with L, so middle income voters form an alliance with lower income voters, after the election, that'll be a pretty good situation if there's redistribution from the higher income voters to that whole group. However, if after the election that L and M win together, there's redistribution not just from the higher income group to the lower income group, but also from middle income voters to lower income voters, that's not so good. So M's decision is going to be driven by which of these two circumstances he expects to face after the election, if M allies with L. Well, that that decision is going to turn out to be driven by the character of electoral institutions. When M is making this decision, it's weighing the possibility of allying with L against the possibility of allying with H. This allying with rich people, the middle class allying with the rich, may not be so attractive because there's not going to be then any redistribution from the rich to the middle class. But it does have one advantage, that there's no risk of redistribution from the middle class to the lower class. So electoral systems help middle income groups, middle income voters, make this decision. In a majoritarian system, that the middle income voters choose between a left-wing and a right-wing party. There is then no formal coalition government. One party just wins the election and they form the government. What this means is that it can be hard for L and H to make promises, well, especially L, to make promises to M about how M will be treated after the election. Suppose that the middle income voters and the lower income voters' representatives come into power together. The lower income, and in the party that has come into power together, the lower income representatives are stronger. They may say, okay, now our policy is going to be to tax M and H all we want, to redistribute to L. What could M do at that point? Absolutely nothing until the next election. So therefore, M will ally with L only if it can believe L, but under a majoritarian system it can't believe L, because there is no guarantee that L will behave the same way once in power as it would have before the election, or as it promised to before the election. Given that L will want to redistribute away from both M and H, if it decides to betray its coalition partner, M will find allying with L more risky. So M will tend to ally with H, with the right, with the rich, as the suboptimal but low-risk option. Okay? However, under a proportional representation system, M's got a different decision to make, a different choice environment, and the reason for this is that things can happen after the election to change the composition of government. In particular, in a proportional representation system, which produces lots of parties, right? A first-past-the-post system, you get fewer parties because it only makes sense to vote for a party that could win the majority, whereas in a proportional representation system, no matter who you vote for, you're quite likely to get some representation, so you might as well vote for the party you like, and naturally that produces many more parties. When you have lots of parties, it's unlikely that any one party will win a majority and form a government by itself, so you tend to get a coalition government. Well, this coalition deal takes place after the election, and at this point, suppose M is saying, okay, I can ally with L or I can ally with H. I'll ally with L, and if L tries to stab me in the back later, I'll just say, you know what, I'm leaving this government, I don't support this government anymore, the government no longer has a majority, and it falls. So M has a credible threat of bringing down the government if its coalition partner goes back on the deal. That means that it's easier for M to ally with L, and you get L and M allied together to tax H. So in proportional representation, Iverson and Soskis argue you get center-left coalitions. Okay, well, I hope that didn't all go by too fast, but if it did, feel free to ask questions to there will be a mechanism for asking questions after this recorded lecture. Now, even if you accept this argument about how proportional representation and majoritarian systems ought to lead to center-left and center-right government predominance, even if you accept that argument, Iverson and Soskis seem to have a kind of problem, which is that they expect more equal distribution and redistribution in a coordinated market economy. And it also turns out to be the case that the coordinated market economies have PR electoral systems. So you get then both of these potential explanations for how you could resolve the Robin Hood paradox. They go together. You can see here in this chart that they've got the, whoops, I've managed to move it again. I wanted to do this, make the nice little thing. Proportionality of the electoral system and non-market coordination, that's a measure that says liberal market economies are down here and coordinated market economies are up here. The less proportional electoral systems are also in the liberal market economies. The more proportional ones are in the more coordinated economies. So which one of these things is important? Well, Iverson and Soskis suggest that there is a complex set of interactions between these two different explainers of the Robin Hood paradox, between the variety of capitalism on the one hand and the adoption of a proportional representation electoral system on the other hand. And the basic idea that they have is that coordination of economic activity around 1900, regional level coordination of economic activity around 1900 in what are now the developed countries, involved specific assets and skills and organized labor and business both wanting some sort of social policy. And they argue that this led important actors, both in business and labor, to promote the adoption of a PR electoral system because they thought that this would enable the giving of guarantees to labor. So both business and capital were interested in an electoral system that would give labor some reassurance that it would always have political representation. So that's the key argument they have for why these things go together. Then you get sort of more specific arguments about why a PR system might reproduce distributional equality and redistribution. But the important thing is that they're arguing that the coordinated variety of capitalism necessarily goes together with the PR system, and the liberal variety of capitalism necessarily goes together with a majoritarian system. Okay, that's it from me. What we have been talking about today is how the issue that people theorizing on a general level about capitalism were concerned about, that, or excited about, depending on their political preferences, namely that poor voters might vote to redistribute to such an extent that there wouldn't be anything like capitalism left, why that didn't pan out in practice, and what different ways do we see in practice of the intersection between distributional concerns and elections. And what we've seen is that a lot of the discussion about intersection in practice tries to explain the so-called Robin Hood paradox. So you should remember that term, Robin Hood paradox, which is that in the most equal countries you also have the most redistribution. And we talked about two schools of thought on why that might be. One that says when labor is powerful both in the market and in government, you get both equal distribution and lots of redistribution. and another position that says labor will be powerful, that doesn't necessarily dispute that point, but says that labor is powerful both in the market and in government when you have both proportional representation and a coordinated market economy variety of capitalism. And that happens in part because capitalists like it as well. Okay, now if you have questions about this lecture, take a look at the email I sent accompanying the link, and I'll explain there how to pose your questions. And I encourage you to look at the questions that other people have posed, and if they are asking something you want to hear more about, let me know by putting a like on that question. It'll all be explained on the Moodle site. And thanks for listening.